Okay, so with the introduction of the just-in-time credential creating, I think that we broke an existing behavior where previously users were able to use our Kubernetes integration with credentials that weren't able to create service accounts or namespaces. And GitLab had this fallback code where it said, look, if we don't have, if the step to create the service account or namespace fails for some reason, we will just happily pass the existing credentials through to your CI job. And users actually wanted that behavior, which is why we're now working on this feature where they can opt out of namespace and service account creation. But I believe all those features that were using that behavior, once we deployed this just-in-time creation of service accounts and namespaces, are now running into an issue where that no longer works for them. So it's a perfectly valid use case for existing people today. Now that we've disabled this feature flag, they can go and put in Kubernetes credentials, which only have access to one namespace, for example, in the Kubernetes integration page. What happens behind the scenes is we look at those credentials, we try to create a namespace in GitLab, in the cluster, we fail, and we just ignore that failure. Doesn't matter at all. When they create a CI pipeline, we just pass their same credentials through to their CI job. Under those circumstances, yeah, that will now be broken with this just-in-time compilation, because we actually will fail the CI job, or it'll get stuck in preparing, is what was happening in this particular version of it.
This is only for project level, right?
Correct. Only for project level. Group level clusters were designed such that they didn't have this fallback behavior. They would pass through no Kubernetes credentials on a group level cluster, which is also a confusing and weird error that happened for a lot of our users when we changed that behavior. But yes, anybody with a group level cluster today that did what I described would end up with no credentials being passed into their CI job, and that was for security reasons, so that we would at least feel that our group level cluster was secure by default. Yeah, so we just discussed before you joined, Tiger suggested, like, okay, so there's one obvious problem here, which is like Rescue will retry these exceptions, will catch and retry these exceptions, which then results in the job staying in a preparing state indefinitely. If you have a certificate error or a bunch of things that are non-transient permanent problems, right? Like a transient problem, like a network timeout or something, it may make sense for us to retry that, but like that's not going to be the default, and we might prefer to just stop retrying and just fail the CI job and let the user retry the CI job if it is indeed a transient error.
Yeah, that's what I meant by rescue.
One solution. Yeah. Right, so let's rescue all errors and just fail the job. Now, the problem that I don't believe this addresses the problem that occurs to me now, which is like people that actually want to use our Kubernetes integration the way it used to behave, where their credentials are never going to be able to create a namespace or service account. For project level clusters only, as we mentioned, group level clusters don't have that fallback behavior. So yeah, how to address that, I'm not actually sure.
We would have to wait for the unmanaged option work to be done, right?
Well, yeah, we might have to wait for that before we can do this just-in-time work. But actually, that seems like a bi-directional dependency, because I think we were waiting for the just-in-time before we wrote that other code anyway. But the thing it still doesn't really address is, okay, the allow me to manage my credentials myself feature is something the user checks when they are creating the cluster. So you still have all of these users that were using Kubernetes integration previously that have broken clusters. Maybe we offer them an edit page where they can go and change that setting retrospectively. And I don't even know if that was in the scope of the feature we were implementing to begin with. But either way, they're all gonna fail immediately until the user goes and specifically does something about it. So allowing users to opt out of namespace creation is related to this, and it would help if we had that feature first, but the user needs to opt into that feature or opt out of namespace creation manually, unless we opt every current project out of namespace creation, or smartly detect how to opt people out of namespace creation. Technically, we know that if a user has a project and that project, if a cluster is associated with a project and that project doesn't have a namespace persisted to our database, or the service account persisted to our database, or whatever, however we model that in the database, we do know that that user, that cluster never was able to successfully create a namespace. And if it's a project level cluster, we know logically that we can infer the previous thing we would have done is pass the original credentials through to the CI job. And in the case of this feature, that means, okay, the thing we should do is skip the preparing stage altogether. If the project currently doesn't have a service account at all, and it's an existing cluster integration, then in theory, we know, all right, well, we should just skip the preparing state where we try to create a namespace and service account, because this has already failed once in the past, and therefore we don't need to try again. We just pass through the credentials the user gave us, because that's what we would have done before. This complicates things a lot, though. I don't know, maybe there's a simpler way to tackle this. Thoughts? Is anybody confused about what the problem I'm describing? I can maybe try to answer.
No, it makes sense. It's just going to be, I'm just trying to think of how we might solve it for people.
I'm trying. I want to like have some incremental approach to improving things here, and I'm wondering, one incremental approach that just pops into my mind is, okay, maybe this just-in-time compilation only applies to group level and instance level clusters. Well, instance level clusters we don't have, but maybe this just-in-time namespace service account creation only applies to group level clusters, and project level clusters keep behaving the same as they did today. The thing that's relevant and interesting about that is that group level clusters and instance level clusters in particular are the only ones that really benefit from this just-in-time namespace and service account creation, or the ones that benefit the most from it, and the main motivating factor for us implementing it. And then on a group level cluster, we won't run into the problem I'm describing, because actually users could not be successfully using group level clusters today in the way I described, because it will not pass the Kubernetes credentials through to your job. This will actually be a UX improvement for those kinds of users, because they'll at least be told, hey, we failed to create your service account and namespace for you, which is why your pipeline is failing, as opposed to just getting past null for environment variables. How tricky is it to do this stuff for just group level clusters? I know that we were talking about deleting code paths that corresponded to triggering these workers when the integration was added to a project. Maybe we can keep that around for the simple path there, which is, okay, when you add a cluster to a project, we're going to trigger this background process that creates your namespace and service account for you. The group one was the more complicated one, where it had to do this logic of, okay, I've got a group cluster, I've got to loop through all the projects, or I've got a project that's added to a group, I've got to loop through all of the clusters on that group. Like there was this refresh logic that's involved looping over things. For the project case, it's much simpler. It's just add a cluster to a project, trigger a background worker just for that cluster and that project ID. Yeah, I don't know. Is that an easier way to tackle it than the more complicated approach I described before, in which we...
I think that would be pretty straightforward. They're actually separate workers for groups and project level clusters. It will grab all of the clusters for a project and create namespaces for them. And then, groups was the other way around, all the projects for a cluster. But that should be relatively trivial to have separate behavior between group and project clusters, I think.
Okay.
And then what are you going to do about existing project clusters?
Well, I think we do nothing, because the existing project clusters will have already triggered the namespace service account creation logic, right? So if you have an existing project cluster today on GitLab, we already attempted to create your service account and namespace for you. And if for some reason that failed during the creation, we have already a certain way that the app behaves, and we're just going to keep it behaving that way. So like basically just in time namespace service account creation just won't apply or mean anything for projects, and they just keep behaving as they do today. Project level clusters.
Yep, that sounds all right to me. It does. Yeah, at some point we definitely do have to clean it up for me. Because maintaining this separate state. I think it's actually long run cleaner to just give up and say, if it's a project level cluster, we will not do anything special. We will not create namespaces, and go for that. That's probably not something that we can do right now, because some people are depending on it. But yeah, that's what I would think as well. And then we can delete a whole bunch of code.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, the whole reason we introduced namespace creation was for group level clusters, and maybe the lesson learned here is we should really have never done it for project level clusters, and there were several problems that would not have happened as a consequence.
Yeah, it also means that the managed stuff, there's no migration path needed as well. For self-managed, we just
yeah.
But yeah, I agree. So if we re-enable the just-in-time stuff only for groups and instance, and of course we rescue from it, then we can turn it on in time for 11.11 or 11.10. Sorry.
Well, in order to turn it on for 11.10, we need it merged. Like we need some improvements here merged in the next 5 days or something.
Yeah.
And it's
both of those patches should be straightforward, I think. I mean, the rescuing part is pretty straightforward, and I feel the same would be the case for the excluding project clusters.
I would just be curious about whether or not we think of those things as code changes that we're adding behind a feature flag, i.e. to get around the exception request process to get something merged in after the 7th. Is this the patches we're describing, are they something that you would actually consider things that are behind a feature flag or regression fixes? I don't know. They're kind of complicated because we did merge our thing behind a feature flag, and all we had to do was switch that feature flag off to get. And we're not going to put a second feature flag in when we make these extra changes. So I don't know. I don't exactly know how to think about it.
I'd say the rescuing part would be a regression fix that should have happened, but the disabling for projects, that's kind of completely different and not scoped at all the original.
Yeah, it's kind of half of a revert as well. Like we're kind of reverting something to fix a regression.
It is also a regression fix. It is a second regression fix, right?
Okay. Yeah, no, you're probably right. Okay, in which case they're both regression fixes, and then it makes sense for us to just go forward with fixing those and try to get them in before 22nd.
Yeah, the second one is not documented anywhere, so it'd be good to write it down somewhere. Yeah.
All right, Tiger, are you going to follow up on both of these regression patches then? Write them down.
Yeah, I can do it. Well, one's documented everywhere, which is the rescue one. That's fine, and that should be. I'm about to push a build for that. I think that one should be okay. And yeah, I can write up the second. I'm not too sure what we do with them after that. What the process is for getting it picked into
Yeah, if we just tag everything with regression 1110, and then we just also add pick into 1110. I think pick into 1110 may actually be optional if we have the regression label, but just add it to be safe.
Right, but still target master.
Yeah, as long as, target master, but that's not the important detail. The important detail is pick into 1110 on as a label on the merge request. And
Right.
we want to make sure that gets in before the final release candidate is created, which will be around about the 22nd, because that means that this feature won't get released to on-premise customers in a broken way. If it gets released to on-premise customers in a broken way, we then have a problem because we have to then tell those customers, hey, you need to disable the feature flag.
No, we do not want to have to do that.
Yeah. So yeah, we really have to finish both of these patches before 1110, or we need to change that feature flag to be defaulting to off for 1110. But
Right.
Well, I think I can have the patches themselves ready today, and I can ping you or Tong to just have a look at those. I think that should be no problem, assuming that everything's green at the moment.
okay, cool. All right, then I will leave that with you.
Yeah, I think we got until the 22nd, right, for any patch releases.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Patch fixes, sorry. Regression fixes. So plenty of time.
I think they're all sorts of things that can be done, and it'll be sub 5 lines of code, I think, to accomplish both of these things. It's just making sure they're doing the right thing.
Okay, cool. Well, let me know when you have the second patch prepared, because I think I'd just like to test that one manually myself so I can make sure that matches my understanding as well. And then we can be a little bit more confident that we haven't broken that existing use case that I was describing. And then, we'll try to get those through.
Yep, sure thing. Sounds good.
Okay. Let's just end it there then.
Cool. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you.